morning, everyone. It is my pleasure and privilege to be here this morning before you to speak about this subject which this morning is going to be John chapter 13, which is intimately connected to the Lord's Supper, which, by the way, you said quite a few things earlier on. This is a solemn passage. This is a solemn subject. And as I consider any subject that is solemn, immediately my mind is drawn to when Moses was on Mount Horeb, and God spoke to him and told him to take off his sandals, for the ground upon which he stood was holy. And so I kind of see this as a spiritual application, that as I approach this subject, that we need to take off our spiritual sandals as we consider what is going to be discussed today in this chapter. Not to say that any portion of Scripture is not holy, for all of it is, but certain subjects bring forward a special kind of reverence. And so in this subject today, I'm going to divide this in two parts. The first part is going to be essentially zooming out, looking at the bigger picture. And then after that, we're going to be zooming in and looking more specifically at the details of chapter 13. And I'm going to start with a question which seems like a question that is completely off track. But as I try to answer this important question, that you're going to see, hopefully, how this connects to what we're going to be talking about today. So the question is, why four different gospels? Why four gospels, right? There's so many answers to this question. One thing for sure is that the Old Testament law states that any matter had to be settled on the testimony of two or three witnesses. And what's interesting is that God has given us in the New Testament accounts of the life of Jesus, not two, the minimum, or three, but even four. And so these different pictures, these different witnesses essentially work together like the pieces of a puzzle to give us an account that is living, that is powerful, that is active, and that speaks to us about who Jesus is and what he has done. And I remember at a time in my life, many years ago, when I would take those accounts and look to demonstrate how they don't fit together, how they contradict each other. That was me. And how amazing it is today to be speaking before you and showing how these indeed come together in the most powerful and amazing way. Two examples to illustrate how these different gospel accounts essentially work together. And the first example that I love to use is one that was already used by Peter Brereton in one of his messages. And that one is essentially, what is the starting point of these different gospels? When you look at Mark, the point of beginning is with the account of John the Baptist. That's where it begins. So when you move to Matthew, you see that in the genealogy, he goes all the way back to Abraham. And then when you look into Luke, that genealogy goes even further back to Adam, the Son of God. And so you have a difference in these three gospels, again, looking at the point of beginning, the point of reference. And what's interesting, and this is going to be relevant with what I'm going to be talking about today, is what about John, right? The synoptic gospels and then the gospel of John. And of course, John begins in the following way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In other words, going back even before time itself. So these four different pictures essentially coming together according to different perspectives and telling the account. Another example that I'd like to highlight, again, before we dive into it, is the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus is talking about future event. And when you look at the Gospel of Matthew, you see that there's about 2 chapters that essentially deal with that subject. Mark and Luke have 1 chapter. What about John? There's no chapter. There's no Olivet Discourse in John. Why is there nothing in John? Well, what's interesting, again, and you see God's sovereign purpose in all of these things, is that God had kept John not to bring a chapter or 2, but an entire book, the book of Revelations, which expands way beyond what we see in the Synoptic Gospels. So you see, again, this different perspective in each of the Gospels. And so right now, what we're going to be talking about is John 13, and more extensively, the Lord's Supper. So once again, we want to go and do this exercise. What do we see in these various accounts? Well, when you look at the Lord's Supper, in terms of how it is presented, what is brought in the Gospel of Luke, we've got about half a chapter, about half. When you go to Matthew and to Mark, there's about a quarter of a chapter. So again, the question is, what about John? Typically, people think that John speaks a lot less about the Lord's Supper because the accounts that we have in the Synoptic Gospels, the same kind of presentation is not found, once again, in John. But don't be fooled, because the actual amount of material in the Gospel of John is way more than all of the Synoptic Gospels. It actually starts in chapter 13, which is what we're going to be looking at today, 14, 15, 16, and 17. 5 chapters. So if you calculate the amount of material in the Gospel of John that is more specifically related directly to the Lord's Supper, it's about a quarter, not of a chapter, but of the entire Gospel. Interesting. Once again, the perspective that John is bringing before us. I want to also ask a question, which is, what is the purpose of symbols, of rituals in the Bible? As we look in the Old Testament, we see a great number of symbols that God has used throughout history, and especially with the Jewish people. And as we come to the New Testament, well, we can ask the question, how many symbols are there in that New Testament? How many rituals do we find? Interestingly, as we examine human history and even in churches and different people, do rituals tend to increase as a function of time? Or do they tend to decrease? They tend to increase, right? Just examine any church, any people, these things tend to increase. What about what we see in the New Testament? And so what I'm going to start with here, just again, very, very briefly, is looking at what are the different symbols that we find in the Old Testament before looking at what we find in the New Testament. So as we look at the different covenants that God has established throughout history with humanity, as we go way, way back in the time of Adam, we see that there's 2 symbols that God instituted, 2 very important commands. The first was, of course, the Sabbath. This is a symbol that is connected to time, the 7th day, and how it points to God's act in creation. The second symbol that we see instituted at that time is marriage. God taking man and woman and essentially bringing them together. So this is not about time, it's about relationships, and essentially points to one of the purposes of creation. So these are the 2 symbols that we see being instituted by God even before sin entered the world. And you've got that line here, you should. Oh, forgot to show marriage. Is then sin essentially arriving on the scene. And so now the question, of course, is, what is God going to now do as a function of that? What are the symbols that he is going to use in order to teach humanity and bring us back to him with all of the different purposes? So after the flood, God establishes a new kind of covenant, which is essentially one that is of a legal nature. Government, capital punishment. This was to administer justice in a world that was now, unfortunately, filled with the reality of sin. And later on, we see that God essentially brings a new type of covenant through Abraham, and that this is, of course, the one that is the sign of, on the flesh, this is the circumcision, and essentially was something that was to be continued for all of the descendants. And God had purposes that we're not going to get into as to what is the reason for all of these different symbols. And of course, as we keep going in time, this is where you see the explosion of all of these different commands and symbols and rituals, which is, of course, the Mosaic Law, where now we have the law given. All of these hundreds and hundreds of commandments that God has given them, these feasts that they had to observe, with all of the sacrifices, the temple, and the priesthood, and all these things, which were physical realities, had spiritual implications. So the question again, as we're coming to John chapter 13 and examining the New Testament, which is, what of this remains today? What of this new covenant? How do we understand all of these things? Well, as we, let me actually keep that there. When we come to the Sabbath, are we under the obligation to observe the Sabbath according to the Old Testament way? No. This is something that has been fulfilled, that ultimately we are not under that obligation as the Jewish people were at that time. We do gather on Sunday to observe the Lord's Day, Resurrection Day. There's a connection between Sunday and the Sabbath. But it's not the same. There's a distinction between the two, and that is made very clear in the New Testament. Second, marriage continues to be something that is a sign that is used today, but it's been magnified. It's been taken even to a higher plane of existence, in that it manifested a spiritual reality that in Christ now we understand the significance of marriage even more deeply. In terms of the legal thing, well, the church is not called to administer capital punishment. I think that there's never been any stoning at Bethel, not that I know. And also in terms of the sign of the circumcision, which was part of the Old Testament law. This is something that we are not obliged to follow anymore, which personally I'm happy about. And concerning the Mosaic law, indeed, we see throughout the New Testament very, very clearly that Christ, in what he has done for us, has not only fulfilled, but put aside all of these things, bringing us into a deeper, more significant relationship with God through him, through what he has done. So the question is, what about the New Testament? What are the signs and symbols that we see in the New Testament? What is new? Well, the first thing that we see that is new is baptism. And I wish I could speak a lot about that, but we don't have time to get into baptism today. So the first new symbol is indeed baptism. And we see how John the Baptist indeed is the one who started bringing baptism even before the way that it is done today. The second is what we're going to be looking at today, which is the Lord's Supper, which interestingly stems very closely from Passover. But it's not Passover. It's inspired from, it continues from, but it's something quite more significant. Incidentally, the Lord's Supper is celebrated on the first day of the week, what we call the Lord's Day or Resurrection Day. And again, there's a connection a little bit with the Sabbath, but it is not the Sabbath. There's a distinction between the two. And while I will not be talking about baptism today, I do want to point out one thing, which to me is so significant and fascinating. And that is that both baptism and communion, or the Lord's Supper, are both drawing some of their significance from the same Old Testament event. Think about that. That both baptism and the Lord's Supper somehow are connected to something that happened in the Old Testament. What is that? And what's the relationship between these two things? Well, as we go back to the time of Passover, when the people of Israel were in Egypt and God redeemed them out of Egypt, that key pivotal moment was, of course, that 10th plague, when essentially they had to take the blood of the lamb, place it over the post, and essentially they would be saved and delivered through this, the Passover lamb. But there's something else that happened down the road not long after that is also extremely important. And that is when they found themselves stuck between the mountains behind them and the great sea before them. And something happened in that context which connects these two New Testament symbols together. Here's the verse. Our forefathers, this is in 1 Corinthians 10, were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Interesting. So baptism draws at least some of its significance from an event that is connected with Israel's deliverance from Egypt. There's a lot more, but that's one of the connections. And this is one of the connections that actually brings together what we're talking about today, which is the Lord's Supper, and essentially even something connecting to baptism. So what's the symbolism that leads to the institution of the Lord's Supper? I think everyone here is quite familiar with the following passage, but I will read it nonetheless. Then, and this is on the 14th day of the first month, they are to take some of the blood, and this is of the lamb that was without blemish, that was sacrificed at twilight, and they would put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they were to eat the lamb. That same night they were to eat the meat, roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs, and bread made without yeast. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night, God says, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you and for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you." So it is in this context of slavery, of hopelessness, that this event is going to take place. And so here we see that the position where they find themselves is one where they have a malevolent master that is over them. Pharaoh, right? The one who is enslaving them and who is taking the life of every one of their firstborn sons. What a context. And in this context, they also have no land, no nation of their own. They're in slavery. They're aliens in a foreign land. And also, they have no freedom. And so they couldn't even worship God. All the things that God required them to do, which they wanted to do, hopefully, for the most part, they weren't even allowed to do so. They were forbidden to worship God in the way that they should have been able to. And so, through this great deliverance, ultimately God brings them to a place where now they have a benevolent master. God sent them. God chose Moses, a very unlikely candidate, in order to become the one who is going to lead them out and to bring them where God wanted to bring them. What a contrast. And once again, he is going to take them to the land that God has promised, that he has set aside for them and for their descendants. The story is, of course, a twisted one, but that's ultimately what God wanted to do. And of course, this brings them to a position where they will have freedom. Freedom to worship God as they wanted to worship him. And we see this being established on that mountain that I just referred to earlier, when God gave the law, God gave the plans for the tabernacle as to how they were going to worship God. And what many of these things might seem, political for a time of Israel, they prophetically pointed to a deeper, greater spiritual reality, which is what we're looking at today. And so even the person of Moses pointed to what ultimately God's own son was going to accomplish, to essentially take us out of a position of slavery, which has nothing to do with political slavery, but the slavery of sin, and that he is the great deliverer. He is not the lamb that was slain just to put the blood on the house, but the blood that is to be applied in each of our hearts in order to find that relationship. And he is the only worthy master. The place where he wants to bring us is, of course, a place where his kingdom is, God's kingdom. And that points ultimately to heaven itself. And finally, and I would say most importantly, instead of being slaves to Pharaoh, slaves to sin, slaves, servants to God, to righteousness, right? This is what we are called to be, servants of God through Christ. So what a picture this paints, once again, as we look at these Old Testament events and what they pointed to. And so when we come to the context of the Lord's Supper, this is what the Jewish people were remembering. And now Jesus is going to be fulfilling all of these things in a very profound way. Why is nothing said about the lamb? Why is so much emphasis on bread and wine? Animal sacrifices are no longer necessary now, since Jesus came and fulfilled the law. Think about it. In all of the accounts of the Lord's Supper, there is no reference to the lamb being eaten. Yet we know that this is what was happening, but there's no reference. And to me, again, this is not an accident, because the focus now is not on the lamb that was slain for the Passover, but the one who is now instituting the Passover feast, who is the Lamb of God in their midst. So we see this being fulfilled. Jesus is also now the high priest according to a greater order, not to the Levitical order, but according to the order of Melchizedek. And these simple symbols that he is taking, that we just see again, that we just partook of this morning, are filled with a profound significance. First of all, bread to the Passover bread that they ate, that the Jewish people had eaten at that time. And remember that that bread was without yeast, which was a picture of the complete removal of sin, deeper, greater symbolism. And we see also the wine now being used as a twofold symbol. Wine in the Old Testament needed to be prepared by the crushing of the grapes. And that was used by God in prophetic language, speaking about the judgment against sin, the cup of wrath that was going to be essentially poured because of sin. But it also speaks about something else. which is wine being used in what context? Joy, the wedding, right? Jesus changing even water into wine in order to bring greater joy at that context. So we see in this symbol both judgment and sorrow that was his to have us enter that relationship with him, and the joy that is now ours as we enter into that relationship. So that was my introduction to John chapter 13. The hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. What an introduction. A lot of things could be said about this. First and foremost, it is just before Passover, and the evening meal was in progress. The context is clear from this chapter that this is indeed that Passover meal that they were sharing together. And it connects it to the accounts in the Synoptic Gospels. Second, when you go to chapter 18 and you look at the first verse, it says this. I didn't put it up here, but you can just listen to what it says. After Jesus had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples, crossed the Kidron Valley, which is in between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. He crossed the valley, and on the other side was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it, and there Judas arrived with the soldiers. So all of the things that happen in between chapter 13 and 18 is indeed connected to this feast that is taking place right here. Notice the language that is being used here. Jesus is saying that his hour has now come. This is something that he referred to over and over throughout his ministry. And now he's saying that that moment has now come. That he was going to be betrayed, that he was going to be handed over to the authorities, that he was going to be judged, and now that hour had come. He had mentioned it many, many times. Let me just go back to one of the times when he mentioned it, and this is in John chapter 12. Jesus says this, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." Think about that. "Very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Now my soul is troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify thy name." Then a voice came from heaven. "I have glorified it and will glorify it again." Speaking of his hour, this is a clear reference to the death that he was going to go through, that everything that was going to happen. And at that moment in chapter 12, something tremendous happens. And that is that the voice of the Father is heard from the heavens. According to my analysis, that's the third time, the only 3 times that the voice of the Father was heard. The first time was at the beginning of his ministry when he was baptized. "This is my beloved Son. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." That was the first time. The second time was towards the middle when he was on the Mount of Transfiguration with a couple of his disciples. Something similar was said there. And now we find ourselves at the end of his life, at the end of his ministry. And once again, the voice of the Father is heard from the heavens. How significant is this? Greatly significant. Not only is this hour not an accident, it is also something that is of great significance. Let me jump ahead to verses 31 and 32 in 13 because it's relevant to what we are now talking about here. When he, that is Judas, had gone, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man is," again the same word, "glorified. And God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself and will glorify him at once." Not only is what is going to happen to Jesus not a surprise, not an accident, it is something that Jesus knows is going to happen, and it is indeed for this very reason that he has come to this hour. First, in terms of the Father, he says this earlier in John, "I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." And accomplishing that will was intimately connected to what was going to happen in that hour. That's the first reason. The second reason is connected to us. Jesus says the Son of Man came to seek and to save those that are lost. Doing the will of the Father meant that he was going to do something for us. Right? And at the center of all of this is what? God's love for us. God's love manifested through Jesus' love for each and every one of us. And the word love, unfortunately, is used, misused, and abused in this world. So as we consider what love is all about, we need to look to Jesus as to what this is all about. And just like our definition of love comes short of what love is, the same is true when we consider power and glory. That as we go through and examine what is happening here, to us, humanly speaking, does this look like power, what Jesus is going through? Does it look like glory, going to the cross? Again, how different is the way we understand and define things. But as we come to how God understands these things, it's so much higher. And we need to recognize and understand these things as much as we can. And in this context, love leads to action. And so Jesus got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. For us who are technically free to take the place of a slave is an amazing thing to do, isn't it? To go out and do that for somebody else. But here we see something so much greater. That Jesus, who came from heaven, laid aside his glory to become human. And then he lays aside that position of freedom and makes himself into a servant for what he is going to do for us. What an amazing thing to see. But it's in this context that we see something quite other. Lord, Peter says, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. No, emphatically, says Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head and as well. Jesus answered, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you. Two things. Number one, isn't it interesting that earlier on Jesus said, you do not realize. He says it, you do not realize. But in this context here, he says, do you understand? Interesting. Meaning there's certain things that as much as we want to understand, they're going to be beyond us. And as we consider everything in the scriptures, there's a lot of things about origins, about evil, about God's purposes, about eternity that are hard to understand. Jesus says, you do not understand. You will understand later. But in this context now, he says, do you understand? Meaning that there's a lot of things that we need to understand, that we need to seek out, that the answers do exist, and he wants us to have those answers. And isn't wisdom being able to know the difference between the two, right? Of the things that we can understand and seek them out, and then realize that certain things we can't understand and don't try to because you're going to go nuts. Wisdom is knowing the difference between the two. Actually, I didn't put the verse up. I apologize. That was the verse. Notice also that knowing is not enough. Oh no, this is the verse. I apologize. He says, do you understand what I have done? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I say to you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will bless You will be blessed if you do them. Knowing is not enough. According to the Bible, if you know something, it's good, but it needs to lead to an action. And so we see here that the blessing is not just in the knowing, but the blessing is in the action that must follow. And it's in this context that we unfortunately reach now the more difficult part of this portion of Scripture. And we're told here that Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, "Very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me." His disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which one of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, Ask him which one he means. Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. And as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, "What you are about to do, do quickly." But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas was in charge of the money, some thought that Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. It would be interesting to analyze what the Passover meal involved, the different steps. And if we analyze it, we would see that Judas was only there for the beginning, the first part, that he wasn't actually there for the later cups of wine, the one that was specifically called the cup of redemption, that he was there for the sop, but he would not have been there for when he broke the bread and said, "This is my body." Little details, but again, when you cross-reference the different Gospels, you see these distinctions. And what we see here is a connection to what we saw in verse 2. In verse 2, we're told that the devil had prompted Judas to betray Jesus. But now we see the completion of this, where Satan entered into him. It's surprising and scary to me to consider that the devil himself could have been anywhere involved in anything on earth. Think of all the terrible things that might have been going on earth at that time. But where did Satan choose to be? He was in the place that was closest to Jesus. And that tells me something important, that we need to be aware that indeed, as hard as it is to imagine, that the devil is at work. And the places that he wants to be at work the most is where Jesus' words are being proclaimed, where the people who follow him are present. And so we need to keep this in mind. Sometimes we feel like it's inappropriate to be troubled. And yet, as we examine the Gospels, and more specifically this verse here, we see that on multiple cases, Jesus, I wouldn't say was overcome, but was affected by deep emotion. We think about when Lazarus died. We're told Jesus wept. We're told also that in this place that he was overwhelmed with sorrow. And also in the Garden of Gethsemane to the point of death. So we must understand that because of the reality of sin and all the issues that we're surrounded with, that it is normal for us, isn't it, to be affected by this as we consider the challenges that are before us. And it's in this context, in this dark, difficult moment, that he says this. He says, "A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples." At first glance, we might think, well, telling to love is nothing new. I mean, Jesus has spoken about love before. And in the Old Testament, we also hear about love. But the difference here is what? As I have loved you. That Jesus' love, as being manifested, is above and beyond anything that has ever taken place on earth. And so that is indeed a brand new command that is of great significance. But once again, in this context, we see that things go downwards a little bit. Simon Peter asked the Lord, "Where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going, you cannot come now, but you will follow me later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Then Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Verily, I truly tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. The chapter started a little bit on a negative note, and it ends also on a bit of a negative note. And there's something that we see in the structure here that is a bit unfortunate. In verse 2, we're told about Judas, the unfaithful disciple, and how he was prompted by the devil to betray Jesus. And then we're told in verse 8 about Peter, who is the faithful disciple, who doesn't understand what Jesus is doing and wants to refuse it. And then we come back in verse 27, how the devil entered Judas during the Passover meal and to deliver Jesus. And then in verse 38, Jesus declares that Peter will deny him 3 times even before the rooster crows. But through all of this, and this is what we need to remember, this is what we need to focus on, is Jesus showing his understanding. He knows where he comes from. He knows why he's here. He knows where he's going, and that what he's going to accomplish is the will of God. That's what we need to focus on. So throughout all of this sin and weakness and darkness, Jesus demonstrates his love for his disciples and for all, taking the place of a slave, washing the feet of the disciples, giving all of the instructions that we find in this context, and telling them to love each other as he loved them, and then how he ultimately goes to the cross. Let me finish by, again, kind of looking at the Lord's Supper, the greater picture, zooming out again. And with this, I'm going to finish. What's fascinating to me is as we consider the Lord's Supper, it is something that truly transcends time. What do we mean by that? Something that draws from the past, that is being done in the present, and that points to the future. In that simple symbol, all of these things are found. In the past, in the sense that we are remembering what God has done. In what context? In the context of the Old Testament, how indeed Israel had been redeemed from Egypt through the deliverer that God had sent. And how this is, of course, Moses. This is remembering history, but it's more than just history. It's prophetic history, because it pointed to something that had not yet been fulfilled. In the New Testament, as we remember these things, we are indeed remembering history, once again, what Jesus has done, but how ultimately through him, all of humanity, through what he's done, will be redeemed through him. And so he is the deliverer. So we're remembering something of the past. Jesus says, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." And what's interesting is that the Greek word here, I'm going to pronounce it correctly, anamnesis. Anamnesis. And it does not mean in memory of. Like when you do something and it's in memory of someone. No. This word is very profound. It essentially means basically entering into a deep affection where you're remembering everything that the person is and what this person has done. For example, a widow who just lost her husband isn't just remembering, is deeply remembering all of the emotions, everything that has been done. It's something that is meant to have great depth. What about the present? Obeying Jesus' command is being done in the moment, and it's to be done every first day of the week, or even more in some cases, as we go through the New Testament. And as I pointed out, it brings to mind 2 different aspects which seem to be contradictory. One is sorrow, remembering the reality of sin and what it entails, the price that needed to be paid, and how Jesus, yes, he went to the cross and he suffered. There's a bit of sorrow. It's a bittersweet moment. But again, the joy that is experienced in seeing the love that brought him to that place and what has been accomplished for each and every one of us. And again, in that present moment, as the scriptures clearly say, is not the cup a sharing, notice the present, a sharing in the blood of Christ? Is not the bread a sharing in the body of Christ? Since there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we partake of the one bread. It is not just to be partaking in the moment, remembering God. But those verses clearly talk about another kind of relationship, not vertical, but horizontal, with each other as we partake, the unity that is within that meal. And last but not least, future, it points to the things that are still left to be fulfilled. Meaning that as we go through this sign, this symbol that Jesus has established to us, it points to the future. From an earthly perspective, the hope in the fulfillment of God's promises on this very earth. That Jesus will return, will stand upon the earth, and will again take of these emblems in the kingdom that he's going to establish. And also from a heavenly perspective, which is going to be the ultimate fulfillment of all of divine prophecy, speaking about the eternity that is to come. And once again, the scriptures are very clear about all of this. In Luke, Jesus saying, "For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And in Corinthians, "For often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." It's a proclamation of the gospel. It's the proclamation of the hope. It's the proclamation of the Savior. All of these things in these simple symbols. It is something that is going to speak to us of fellowship, of sustenance, and rest in him. So I just pray that these few thoughts and verses and are brought closer to mind and closer to heart as we continue before God's presence.